Kia ora everyone, welcome to this interview for Kiwi RPG Week. My name's Greg Ellis and I'm joined by Tim Denee, who is the creator of Deathmatch Island. I'm also joined by a team of builders who you may hear in the background throughout this interview. I'm sorry to do that, but this is an interview I was really passionate about getting out and something we want to share with you in Kiwi RPG Week. G'day, Tim. First thing, I suppose, is tell everybody a bit about the game. As you know, I'm sort of a slightly nerdy super fan of it all, but tell everybody else a little bit about Deathmatch Island.
Sure. I mean, it kind of does what it says on the tin. I mean, it's a death match on some islands, but I mean, in brief, you wake up, you've got these hazy memories, you're in a team of other competitors wearing matching sort of jumpsuits, and then you kind of explore these islands, you make allies, you fight other people, you acquire sort of resources and weapons and things, you fight for your lives, you progress through a few different islands, you find out mysteries about the game, you maybe look behind the curtain a little bit and go in some places you're not meant to, you have flashbacks about your past and discover more about your character. And then at the very end, you have to decide whether you're going to turn on each other and find out who's going to be the single winner of the big competition, or will you find a way to sort of break the game and escape? So that's kind of the whole thing in a nutshell.
And it uses an existing system, but one that other people may not necessarily be familiar with. So you want to tell us a little bit about the Paragon system that it uses?
Sure. So the Paragon system was designed by John Harper and Sean Nittner for Agon 2nd edition, which is about Greek heroes. You all roll the dice together, and then you all sort of narrate what happens after the roll. So in Agon, that takes the form of kind of boasting about your great deeds. In Deathmatch Island, that takes the form of sort of reality television, confessional to the camera kind of thing. But what it really means is that the friction of the mechanics is kind of front-loaded. You kind of go through this little procedure all together. But once that's done, you know who's the winner, who's the loser, and you all just get a chance to kind of narrate what happens and build the story together. So it has a little bit of that kind of hippie collaborative storytelling stuff, but because it's through this kind of lens of like reality television confessionals, it's actually quite approachable and it doesn't feel, there's kind of a layer of meta that we're sort of used to.
Speaking of the rules and things, one of the things that it does separate it from from things like, for example, like D&D or some of the more traditional ones, is it's a dice pool game. So for those people who aren't sort of familiar with that sort of thing in terms of mechanics, just want to tell us a little bit about the sort of the mechanic of Deathmatch Island that makes it different from chucking a D20, for example.
Yeah, sure. So kind of as I mentioned before, it's sort of front loading that dice pool. Basically, you approach a particular situation, what the game calls a contest, and I've explained it elsewhere that it's kind of more scene-based resolution rather than like task-based. So in D&D or something, it's like I want to pick the lock, so you roll to pick the lock. In Deathmatch Island, it's more like, okay, we're approaching the shipping port, and we want to get those crates of equipment, and we want to get out. You're going to roll dice for that whole scene, not just for running over there, not just for shooting those people, convincing those people, and getting out. Instead of all those things being separate rolls, you're all going to roll up front. And so, yeah, the way you do that, as you said, is to assemble a dice pool. And by putting things into the pool, you're kind of front-loading your approach to the contest. So you'll decide, like, how are we approaching this? Is it going to be like with physical skill or sneaking around? So that's going to determine some dice, and then you can choose what equipment you want to use from your sheet. That would put other dice in the pool. You might have other advantages you can use. And so you're assembling a dice pool, but you're also making decisions about how you approach the contest. Then you all roll together, and then you can use the results to kind of divine or figure out exactly how that whole scene went for everybody.
Yeah, which I love, and some players struggle with it. They do struggle with that whole idea of, you mean I get to tell you, and can can I say that I've double backflipped over the fence? It's like,
exactly.
Yeah, you can. So it is that there is that tension, but it's also, I think once people start to play it, they start to go, oh, this is so free. I can actually, in many ways, they call D&D gets called, you're saying that you're playing superheroes. But you're actually limited because it's broken down so granularly as to what you're doing. But there are the possibilities in Deathmatch Island for truly heroic things to happen that people can do. And as long as everybody sort of goes, yeah, that fits with the reality that we've got at the table, yeah, you can do that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it also allows, because it's not sort of fragmented and broken up, it kind of allows those sort of handovers and big plays, because you kind of know the shape of the scene. This person's done mid lane and this person's the best, so they're the one who's going to get the slam dunk. And so you can kind of hand off between players and set things up and have a bit more fun with it that way. I often think about it sort of almost like the sports metaphor, like you can kind of have that play down the field of like intercepting the ball and then passing it to this player. They pass it on to that player and set up the person who gets the goal or whatever. Lost my metaphor, but you can kind of do that in Paragon in a really kind of seamless way, and every contest kind of has a bit of that feel just from the mechanics.
I think one of the things that I really like about the system is that the game master is no longer responsible for driving everything. And as somebody who DMs or GMs a lot of systems, having the players take most of the heavy lifting is amazing. What is it that you sort of really like about that? Because you've done a couple of other things in the Agon system as well. So
that's right, and played a lot of Agon itself. I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there. It's a lot of games kind of promise that sort of collaboration, but I find with Agon very effortlessly, even with people who aren't necessarily kind of primed for that sort of collaborative atmosphere. As in these games, you don't even call the GM, but as the sort of GM person, you really do get to sort of just sit back and everyone's kind of telling their bit of what happens, and you can just be entertained for like, at least 80% of the time, which never happens when you GM other stuff. And I do think, it's quite a neat way of sort of structuring that and making that happen without kind of forcing it too much. It's you don't necessarily get the stress of like a GM-less improvisational game, but you still get that kind of collaborative improvisational thing.
Yeah, and as you say, because there is that familiar tropes, it is, that anybody who's ever watched any of that reality TV or things like Lost or Hunger Games or any of those cultural touch points that you have a pretty good idea of what they're doing. So that was one of the things I wanted to talk about, with the inspiration. Were there any other bits of inspiration for you apart from those kind of things where, when you were developing it?
Yeah, I think the first layer was definitely sort of deathmatch media, of which there are a billion examples, but definitely like Squid Game and Battle Royale from the year 2000, I think. And there are a lot of other ones, but all those things are sort of broadly similar, I think. Then the second layer was, I definitely wanted this kind of like Lost, the TV show, Severance, the video game Control, all of which I'd say are kind of like in that mystery box genre where there's something weird and spooky going on that may or may not be sinister, but it's kind of, the joy is exploring that mystery without necessarily exactly finding out what's going on. So that's kind of layer two. And then the third thing, as we've discussed, there's definitely a strong reality television influence. I do love reality TV. There's a lot of Survivor in this, but also even other reality TV, like with some of the stretch goals, we've now done like a Match Island romance version of Deathmatch Island. So that's kind of got Bachelor and Match Island and things like this. And all that stuff is definitely in the game. So in Agon, you compete for glory, but in Deathmatch Island, you compete for followers, and so the idea is the more followers you have, the more the whole competition kind of bends around you, which you'll see if you've watched any reality television. Once a particular character or person becomes popular on social media, production will find a way to keep them in the show and give them more airtime. So that's kind of the genre conceit there.
And you mentioned production. So production is in Deathmatch Island, it's the name that the Game Master character gets, but it's also this other very it's a sinister force that exists behind everything. But also, it's very much involved in the design and the look and feel of the game, so that production is everywhere, like it would be in a show. And was that something that you set out to do, or is that something that came to you as you were developing it?
No, it was more of a later edition. I mean, pretty early on, but originally I knew this would be a deathmatch game, so you have competitors fighting competitors. So you got these two sort of points of tension, but it wasn't long before I realized there's sort of a question mark there of who's making these people fight each other and why. And I think that's a really sort of fruitful part of the genre, and it's always my favorite part. Like my favorite part of Squid Game is seeing that one character kind of going behind the curtain and trying to figure out what's going on and what's this all about. So pretty early on I knew I had to address who's behind this and why are they doing this. And so that's where production came in. I didn't want the answer to be too pat. I mean, no spoilers for Squid Game, but I find the answer in that a bit dissatisfying in the end. So production is this kind of clinically corporate presence. It lets me introduce a lot of sort of black humor into the game, because it's kind of got these like motivational slogans and things like this, and also a lot of ambiguity, like what I sort of describe as like a kind of corporate Helvetica, corporate horror sort of tone of production. It kind of implies there's like a greater purpose to Deathmatch Island. You're not just deathmatching. It's not ultra-violence for the sake of it, but is it like a entertainment product for the super wealthy, or is it some big scientific experiment, or that tone of production, I think, allows a lot of the ambiguity, and so then you can kind of explore like why is all this going on.
And every game, every table finds their own motivation, and that's built into the rule set, right? There is that set of theory crafting where, again, which is another term which is very much of our time, that goes into, that goes on behind it.
Yeah, exactly. So so the game has maps and you explore locations, and those locations sort of have pre-written like stuff that you find. So it's not all kind of improvised and made up, right? But depending on where the players go and what they encounter, they get a chance to kind of discuss and theory craft about what's going on behind that. And then the GM player, the production player, can kind of use that theory crafting to then feed back into the system and steer things in their own way. So it is sort of collaborative about what's going on, but it's not, you're not just sitting down and making it up. You're kind of, there's kind of a feedback loop that's going on that, I think kind of, it does feel, there's an element of discovery. Like, it doesn't just feel like you're sort of making all this stuff up, even though in a way you are.
Yeah, but there, I mean, as a person who's game mastering, who's the production, there's just enough in there to allow me to set it up to then, and I suppose that's the other thing, because as a game master you don't know either what production is, then you set it up, but you kind of have to rely on everyone, so that doubles down on the ambiguity. There is nobody who knows. You can't flip to the back of the adventure and go, there it is, like you can with so many others.
Yeah, and hopefully that means it's always sort of tailored to the tastes of each group, because it's a little bit custom each time. And there is a little bit of that feeling of like, if you've watched Lost or Severance, there's kind of that question of like, are they just making this all up as they go along? It's definitely an aspect of that.
The other thing about it from, two other things that struck me. One is that there is an element of corporate hellscape in there. How much of that corporate hellscape is informed by your own life and what you've had to deal with, and how much of it is just, based on some of those things like Severance, for example, that really, have spoken to you?
Yeah, Severance and Control for sure. I mean, but I do think a large part of it comes from my own experience. I work as a graphic designer as a day job, and I've worked at various agencies and things. And I mean, I hope my own work doesn't descend into the horror, that level of horror. But, I've been adjacent to that stuff for a long time. I used to work in sort of e-learning, which is kind of steeped in sort of corporate propaganda. So yeah, I've kind of been swimming in that pool for a long time. So it was very cathartic to be able to use those experiences and kind of amp them up into this sort of horror product.
That was going to be my follow-up question. Was it cathartic for you? So yeah.
Yeah, I love it. It's fun.
So you mentioned that you are a graphic designer, and so how important was the design element to it? Because there are some games out there now, like Merkborg, for example, that are very design driven. What was the process for you?
Yeah, I mean, I can't separate the two either. It's just how I approach these things. So the visual design was absolutely like step number 1 or 2. So concurrent with kind of stream of consciousness, early game ideas that make no sense to anyone but me. I'm also working on the mood board. You know, the logo, I think, was one of the first things I created for the game, which is completely unnecessary and a silly way to work. But that's just how I have to approach these things. The character sheet as well. You know, for me, you can't separate the kind of the visual design and visual communication from the way the mechanics and the game design is communicating. I sort of think, you know, Merkborg's a good example where you could say a lot of that game is vibes, and the visual design is selling those vibes. So that is absolutely part of the game design as well. And that's also how I approach these things.
And I think maybe that part of the reason that some of those games work well as a design piece, and I think it might be the same for Deathmatch Island, is because there aren't a lot of rules and mechanics. So you can step back and appreciate the design, or in the case that some people find with things like Cyborg or Merkborg, actually battle with the design to actually find the game in there. So, you know, the advantages of being reasonably rules light means that you can engage with that a little bit more.
Yep, I think that's right. And I mean, Deathmatch Island is, yeah, I think Merkborg is an interesting comparison because I do think they're both sort of graphic design first, but it's funny because Merkborg has this kind of, I don't know, metal punk sort of style, and you know, Deathmatch Island is kind of the opposite aesthetic from that, and this kind of Swiss modern, like Helvetica and the Grid and all that. That's sort of a bit about the game. It got picked up by Evil Hat, or Evil Hat is publishing this one. Tell us a little bit about that. How did they discover it? Did you pitch it to them? What was the journey about working with a reasonably large publisher like that? Yeah, I mean, I had been keeping a bit of Twitter, as it was then, a bit of a Twitter sort of development diary, just posting screenshots and stuff, and I guess that had got a bit of attention from the sort of graphic design point of view. And I've been keeping that going for a while. So there was a bit of profile from that. I mean, Evil Hat published Agon, which is where Paragon comes from. And there were plenty of Paragon games, but none that were sort of standalone published. So I think there was kind of an interest in publishing a second Paragon game, if you like, not just Agon, but something else. So there was some appetite there. And maybe Deathmatch Island kind of came along at the right time. Like, there was a bit of interest from this Twitter thread. It was a substantial standalone Paragon game, kind of had a pretty easy, clear premise. The premise is just in the title. Had a clear aesthetic, which I baked in from the beginning. So yeah, I think it was kind of a right place, right time sort of thing, basically.
And how have you found it working with the resources of a big publisher? What have been the good things? What have been the challenges? Have there been any?
Yeah, it's been a very positive experience. I mean, Evil Hat is great, lovely people. Really glad to have partnered with them. I think my experience is a bit different because I do all my own layout and design and illustration, which most of the authors that work with don't, so they would do that stuff. So that would be quite a different experience. But even so, just working with them and the contractors they work with in terms of experts in like crowdfunding and sensitivity reading and editing and fulfillment and admin, just a million other things that I have like no clue about and I would not want to take on myself. Like, I don't think I could have self-published this game. So yeah, I mean, from that aspect, it's been great. But I think the most surprising thing is that, you know, Evil Hat is a relatively sort of like big player in the space, but it's still really just a few people, most of whom are part-time. So it's really kind of opened my eyes to how in this industry, we're all just sort of trying our best with limited resources, even the big players.
In film terms, they would call what you do, you're basically an auteur. You are doing it pretty much yourself. There is nobody else really involved in the creative process. You're doing the layout, you're doing the design, you're creating the game. Was there any other creative input that you had, or is it really it is kind of it's the solo journey for you?
There's definitely other creative input. Sean and John themselves, the creators of Paragon, gave me developmental advice on the system, so that was great. And I've worked with, got feedback from other sort of Paragon designers like Greg Soper and people on the Discord. So there's definitely been other creative input, which has been great. And obviously, everyone you play test with is sort of giving you ideas and input. But yeah, it is. It's kind of the roundabout way to try and do it all yourself, and I don't think it's advisable. But ultimately, that's what I enjoy about this hobby is, being able to use these different sort of parts of my brain and different skill sets and sort of combine them all in one. And to be honest, as I said, I've been working sort of in agencies and client work for a long time, and you kind of just get tired of doing what other people tell you to do. So there's a real joy for me in being able to make your own thing, and you can just make it however you want, and you're not beholden to anyone.
This isn't the first thing you've made. You've made a few other things as well that are sort of lurking around the back. One of the ones that I'm just bringing up because I absolutely love it is Odyssey Aquatica. Have you got any further plans for that?
Yeah, for sure. Because Paragon used to be sort of playset only, which was a way of saying you couldn't do a standalone game. It had to just sort of be like a DLC. I actually quite like that model, and that's what made it feel approachable to me to make these playsets. Odyssey Aquatica still is in that format, so it's not a standalone game, but now that you can make standalone Paragon games, I would love to make it standalone, just because I think it's easier for people to play. They don't have to reference to rule books or whatever. So that's something I would love to do. I also do have some ideas for sort of version 2. I've had some feedback from people on various aspects. So yeah, I'd love to come back to Odyssey Aquatica. I'm also, that also sort of is kind of a special game to me. Sort of a Wes Anderson Life Aquatic thing, very different to Deathmatch Island.
Yeah, it is. It's really different, but it's one that I think people should check out on your own, old dog games. I suppose what now? What is next for Deathmatch Island, and what is next for Tim?
So Deathmatch Island is now publicly available, so it's out. So that's great. In terms of sort of new releases, I've got a third-party toolkit that I've been working on, so I'll release that soon, hopefully. So that'll be a bunch of layout templates, an open license so people can create and sell their own stuff for the game, and guidelines for like making your own islands and casts and things like that. So that's kind of first cab off the rank. And then I've got a few island ideas I want to make myself. Someone on the Discord suggested a Willy Wonka island, so now I really want to manifest that, like a death chocolate or something. I think that would be a lot of fun, especially after that Scottish AI Oompa Loompa Willy Wonka experience. So yeah, definitely stuff happening there. In terms of other games, I'm currently working on Blades in 68, which takes Blades in the Dark and moves it forward 100 years to the sort of swinging 60s and 70s. And it's kind of bit of a silly idea, but it's a lot of fun, and about halfway through on that, so keep an eye out for that.
Awesome. So lastly, I suppose this will be coming out around Kiwi RPG Week. Are there other games or designers or things that are out there at the moment that either you've already been playing that are Kiwi games, or that you go, I really like to get my hands on that, or things like that in terms of, other creators?
Mm-hmm. Maybe it's just because I've been working on Blades in 68, but I've been thinking a lot about A-State by Morgan Davey. Just great game, amazing ideas in there, well worth checking out. I think is one of the kind of sort of driving forces behind Kiwi RPG. Mork can be a very self-facing person, but he's got some amazing games, and A State is one of them. And I think, yeah, well worth checking out, especially if you're a fan of sort of Blades in the Dark or Forged in the Dark adjacent things.